Just a very quick review of what we were talking about the last time we
That
met.
looks good.
Paul had gotten through insisting that there was no such thing as a most favored nation.
You haven't read.
He said there was a no most favored nation clause in God's covenant.
Got it?
The Jews, of course, had long believed they were chosen by God to be special people, but they interpreted that as meaning they had special privileges and considerations. And to a certain extent that would be true, but they ignored the fact that with special status came special responsibility and obligation. That part they just kind of swept aside, which is a typical human thing, and we do it all the time. So don't be too critical of the Jews, because we're all guilty of that sort of thing. Once he gets through with all of this thing about the Jews not being that special, he turns his attention to the Gentiles. He says the Jews did have the one advantage over the Gentiles, and that was the possession and familiarity with the law. The Jews had a law. And so it would be easy for the Gentiles to say, well, the Jews had the law, and it's only fair that God should condemn them, because they should have known better. They had the law. But us Gentiles, we should be exempt from judgment, because we didn't have the law, and we didn't know any better.
They tried that at Nuremberg.
Yeah, right.
Brian, does Gentiles include everybody?
Anybody but a Jew.
Okay,
Right.
even Samaritans?
Well, now Samaritans would have been a slightly different situation. They were considered by the Jews to be perverted Jews.
They were stepped down.
They were stepped
Yeah,
out.
well, they
and
were
stepped out.
not quite as low as the Gentiles, but close to it.
Because Paul didn't make that distinction.
No, he doesn't make the distinction at all between Samaritan and Jew. And he wouldn't. He would say it doesn't make any difference. You know, we're all equally guilty because of sin. Doesn't mean there's who you are. Anyway, he says a person will be judged, and he tells this to the Gentiles. A person's going to be judged by what they had the opportunity to know. If you knew the law, then you're going to be judged accordingly. If you didn't know the law, you'll be judged as a person who didn't know the law. He says God's fair. God's not unfair. In other words, we're going to be judged by our fidelity to the highest morality that is possible for us to be aware of and to know. And he says, even those who did not know the written law of Moses still had an unwritten law within their hearts, if you will, the instinctive knowledge that human beings have between right and wrong. In the very nature of man, there is a basic understanding of those things that you can do and should do, and those things you shouldn't do. So Paul pretty much sees the world divided into two classes of people: the Jews with their God-given law in writing, and the rest of the world without the written law, but still with a God-implanted knowledge of right and wrong. And so his point is this: nobody can claim ignorance from God's judgment.
It also explains the fact that atheism is not possible.
Well, it does. Well, you
The
can
sense of
fool
right.
yourself. You can fool yourself into believing.
You could claim to be an atheist, but you can't if you sense right and wrong.
Yeah, if you sense right and wrong, then
Yeah,
you're
you're off.
admitting, by Paul's
Right.
explanation, that
Right.
there is a God. Now, starting with verses 17. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, if you know His will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of infants, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhors idols, do you rob temples? You who brag about the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Circumcision has value if you observe the law, but if you break the law, you become as though you had not been circumcised. If those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you, who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker.
Is that just a symbol for knowing the law? The
What?
circumcision?
Circumcision is a symbol for being a member of the chosen people, if you're a man. So it is, in a sense, yes. Paul says a man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a man's praise is not from men, but from God.
Doesn't make any sense to me at all. I'm sorry.
Paul says, you want a definition of what a Jew is? Let me tell you. It's not by being a descendant from Abraham by blood. That doesn't get it. If you were a Jew in Paul's day, and you heard him say this, it would have been extremely upsetting. I mean, it would have been shattering.
Brian, are they talking about circumcision, the surgery, or circumcision as a, whatever, to say that it's of the heart or of the
Well,
mind, or, I mean, that's all, that's what.
There were two things that clearly identified a Jew.
Well, yeah.
Okay, circumcision and being of the blood
Of a-
descendant of Abraham.
All right,
Those two
okay.
things
I
made you
knew
a
that,
Jew.
but
Paul
what's
says,
that?
baloney. That's not really what a Jew means,
Okay.
okay? The Jew was regarded by God in special favor simply by means of racial descent and circumcision. That's the way the Jews saw it.
Okay.
Paul says, sorry, folks, Jewishness is not a matter of race at all. Being favored by God, it has nothing to do with circumcision. It's a matter of conduct. How do you live your life?
Then could we consider ourselves Jews?
Absolutely, by that definition.
Okay.
It follows then, to Paul's way of thinking, that there are many Jews of pure descent and who have been circumcised who are really no Jews at all. And equally, it follows that there are many Gentiles who have never heard of Abraham and would never dream of being circumcised, God forbid, who are real Jews in the true sense of the term. Any believing Jew at that time would have been aghast at this. I mean, this was the worst conceivable possible heresy you could utter if you were a Jew. But here is Paul, not only a Jew, but a previous Pharisee, who said, I mean, it would have just been mind-blowing for people if you were Jewish. Paul then goes on to say, it's even worse than that. He tells the Jews, it's even worse than that. He said, Jewish behavior has made the name of God a dirty word among the Gentiles.
Now that I didn't understand what he meant by that.
I'm going to tell you. Is that a surprise?
We're just a little bit ahead of you.
They insisted, or that instead of the name of Jehovah being promoted and respected amongst the Gentiles, the name of God was repudiated and detested among the Gentiles because of the Jews. Why? Why was that so?
Well, because they thought they were the chosen people, that would be a little hard to take.
Well, that was part of it. That was part of it. First of all, Paul says Judaism was commonly regarded as barbarous, a superstition. The Jews themselves were looked upon as contemptible rabble. I mean, after all, they were just slaves that escaped from Egypt. You know, even then in the time of Jesus, Jews were unpopular people all throughout the world. They've always been. And the same reasons that caused that to be true then always cause it to be true now.
Is it jealousness on the part of
No.
Jews?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Let me go
Well,
through
I
some
can
of
tell
these other
you,
reasons.
we lived in New Jersey for many years, and in New York, there's a concentration of Jewish people. And they have a reputation in that part of the country of being pushy and arrogant. And you go to the grocery store and you find out what that means.
I'll tell you what it boils down to. They're different. Human beings don't like human beings that are different.
Well,
Well, and they have such strong family ties, and their children, so many of them are so, you know, they promote education, and, I mean, I have a lot of,
Nothing wrong with that.
I agree with what you said, but I also see all these, you know.
Oh, there's a
the
lot of good
lawyers,
things
the
about-
doctors,
yeah, oh,
you know, the
yeah.
neurosurgeons, the whole thing, you know.
No, I'm not trying to be negative
No, I
about
know
them.
you were saying
but-
one thing, but I have this other perception also.
Yeah. Oh, they're very intelligent. One of my best friends was a Jewish lady, and I went to her her ceremony in her synagogue where she recited the Torah in Hebrew, and you know she had learned Hebrew, and it was awesome. But you go to the grocery store, certain stores up there, and some of those women will just come and push you right out of line with their carts, you know. And I mean, they're very
I had a
assertive.
Jewish family on my raft the other day. They were from New York. And, I mean, it took me 2 minutes to understand that they
figure
were
out.
Jewish.
Hmm.
I checked my manifest, and sure enough, it was a Hebrew name. And they were.
Hi,
How you
Frank.
doing? Come on in.
Oh, look who's here.
They did not take our lunches. They brought their own lunch. It was
Oh.
obvious that they wanted only a kosher food. So anyway, they were very obviously Jewish, New York, and they were kind of obnoxious and pushy and so on and so forth. At the very end of the trip, when they got off at Willow Beach, they turned around and said, "Thank you, we had a great time." And I said, "Thank you very much for saying so, shalom." He said, "Shalom." Yeah, you know.
You grew up in an entire Jewish neighborhood when you lived in Maryland.
I did too.
Yeah, Larry saw.
I did not have a single playmate that was Gentile. Every one of my playmates were Jewish.
I had one.
That's true.
So I learned very early in my life a special
Seeing this out, it's
understanding
Mhm.
because I grew up in an all-Jewish neighborhood in the Second War,
Oh.
40s.
Well, would this
Boy.
be, that situation be kind of related to the Mormons here, I mean, as far as we're concerned?
Well,
That they're
there's a
pushy
lot of
or-
prejudice against the Mormons because they're different.
Okay.
They do things differently.
Yeah.
Well, let me go through all the things that
Yeah, yeah.
We took over your class.
Yeah, that's okay.
Sorry.
Let me go through all the things that are part of this prejudice thing against Judaism. Judaism was, first of all, their customs were ridiculed. I mean, you know, they have a ban on pig flesh, right? Well, people said, you know why that is? It's because they worship pigs. They won't eat pig flesh because their god is a pig. That was one thing. The custom of observing Sabbath. Well, that's nothing but a bunch of people that are using an excuse to be lazy. You take one day of the week and they don't do anything. That's just laziness. The Jews were especially disliked because they had been extended certain privileges by the Romans that nobody else had. They were allowed to transmit the temple tax every year to Jerusalem from all over the then known world. They were allowed, to some extent, to have their own court, the Sanhedrin, and live according to their own laws. The Roman government respected the Jewish observance of the Sabbath, and Jews were exempt from conscription into the Roman military.
That's a biggie.
Those things rubbed people raw in the wrong place.
Really?
The Jews were accused of being atheists. Now that's weird. How could they consider the Jews to be, well, I'll tell you, because they didn't have any visual signs of worship. They didn't have an idol of any kind. They didn't have a deity that could be seen, and so people say, well, their deity is just a figment of the imagination, some invisible God somewhere. The Jews were detested because of their attitude toward all other religions, which was contempt. They held everybody else in contempt. And they were accused of hatred of their fellow man because they refused to mix with other people, right? Okay. We all are aware of their attitudes toward non-Jews as being untouchables. Pharisees, for example, if they accidentally rubbed up against a Gentile in the marketplace, they had to go to the temple and be cleansed. It made them unclean. So, the end result of all this, the name of Jehovah, the God of the Jews, was held in contempt by all of the people. And Paul is saying, that's your fault, Jews. You have shut yourselves up into a rigid, isolated community from which everybody else has been shut out. Now, I want you to listen to this really carefully. Judaism was a religion with closed doors, closed hearts, and closed
Those
minds.
minds.
Does that remind you of something?
Yes,
It's the exact opposite of what we believe as Methodists. Open minds, open hearts, open doors. And you know what? Paul was absolutely correct on that point. It was true. Okay, now, we move into, and that's why Paul was saying, a man is not a Jew if he's only one outwardly, circumcised, and so on. It has much more to do than that. What advantage, then, is there in being a Jew? Or what value is there in circumcision? Paul says a whole bunch, in a whole lot of ways. He says, much in every way. First of all, they have been entrusted with the very words of God, the oracle of God, which is the Ten Commandments. What if some did not have faith? Will their lack of faith nullify God's faithfulness? Not at all. Let God be true and every man a liar, as it is written, so that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. But if our unrighteousness brings out God's righteousness more clearly, what shall we say about that? That God is unjust in bringing his wrath on us? And then in parentheses, Paul says, I'm using a human argument here. Certainly not. If that were so, how could God judge the world? Someone might argue, if my false spirit enhances God's truthfulness and so increases his glory, why am I still condemned as a sinner? Why not say, as we are being slanderously reported as saying, and as some claim that we have said, let us go about doing evil so that good may come about as a result. Their condemnation is deserved. Paul uses here an imaginary objector, okay, to stage an argument. And the best way to disentangle this narrative is to redo the passage as a dialogue, and that's what I'm going to do from Barclay.
I'm sure God would have Barclay. We'd always be sitting here confused.
No.
Okay, you have
Paul
an
is hard.
objector. And the objector says, the result of all that you've been saying is that there is no difference between Gentile and Jew, and that they are in exactly the same position. Do you really mean that? Paul, by no means. Objector, well, what then is the difference? Paul, for one thing, the Jew possesses what the Gentile never so directly possessed, the commandments of God. Objector, granted, But what if some of the Jews disobeyed those commandments and were unfaithful to God and came under his condemnation? You have just said that God gave the Jews a special position and a special promise. Now you're going on to say that at least some of them are under the condemnation of God. Does that mean that God has broken his promise and shown himself to be unjust and unreliable? Paul, far from it. What it does show is that there is no favoritism with God and that he punishes sin wherever he sees it. The very fact that he condemns the unfaithful Jews is the best possible proof of his absolute justice. He might have been expected to overlook the sins of this special people of his, but he does not. Objector. Very well then, all you have done is to succeed in showing that my disobedience has given God an opportunity to demonstrate his righteousness. My infidelity has given God a marvelous opportunity to demonstrate his fidelity. My sin is, therefore, an excellent thing. It has given God a chance to show how good he is. I may have done evil, but good has come out of it. You can't surely condemn a man for giving God a chance to show his justice. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Paul says, an argument like that is beneath contempt. You have only to state it to see how intolerable it is. Let's go on with this a little further. There's a number of basic thoughts being presented here through this manufactured argument. First of all, Paul will insist to the very end that the Jews did hold a special position in relation to God. He doesn't argue against that at all. But he also believes that they had a special responsibility and a special obligation, and that's what made the Jew different. The Jews were entrusted with the Ten Commandments of God, the words of God. By this, the Jews are told, you are a special people, and therefore you must live a special life. God's choice of his people was for special duty, not for special privilege. Paul believes that God was certainly justified in condemning the Jews. In fact, Paul's position is that the more a people are given the duty to do the right thing, the greater the condemnation if they don't do it. But what about the Jews who were faithful? There were faithful Jews, weren't there? They may be few, but they had kept their promises to God. And Paul considered this, quote, remnant to be the true Jewish people, the real nation of chosen people. He said the rest of them all lost their privileges because of their behavior, because of their attitude. But all of this having been said, Paul was always sure that God's rejection of Israel was not final. In the end, unbelievable, it would be the Gentiles who would bring the Jews back into the fold. Gentile and Jew would become one in Christ. See, the Jew was supposed to evangelize the Gentile. In the end, it's the Gentile who has to evangelize the Jew. And you know, even today, in our modern world today, that's happening. That's happening. If you're familiar with New York, you've seen people with Jews for Christ on their lapels.
Jews for Jesus.
Jews for Jesus. The root cause of the Jews' sin was disobedience to the known law of God. That is pride. And that pits the will of man against the will of God. And then at that point, man begins to devise all kinds of ingenious ways of justifying his sins. Instead of professing humility and confessing that sin and being penitent, everybody starts trying to justify and make excuses for why they have done what they have done. I hate to be involved in a debate with Paul. I'd lose. So, Paul says, what should we conclude then? Are we any better? Not at all. We have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law we become conscious of sin. What a thing for a Pharisee to say, that no one is made righteous through the law. Pharisees spent their whole life from birth to death desperately trying to keep the law to become righteous. But here's a Pharisee, ex-Pharisee, who says, sorry, it doesn't work that way. What do you think? In this previous passage, of course, Paul has just finished saying that the Jew has a special position with God, despite everything. But then an objection is raised. Does that mean that the Jews are better than everybody else? The answer Paul gives is absolutely not. Jew and Gentile alike are under the dominion of sin as long as they are without Christ. In a Christless state, every person is under the control of sin, and every person is helpless to escape from it. The description that we have here in verses 10 through 6 is a terrible definition of human nature when Christ is absent. In short, without Christ, a person has perverted character, a destructive tongue, and damaging behavior. It's what happens when God is disregarded. Paul never underrated the power of sin over mankind, but he never underrated the redeeming power of Christ either. He says mankind is inherently sinful and bad, but never so bad that he can't be saved. Paul includes himself. This is what Christ has done for me personally, Christ can do for anybody. If he can do what he did for me, as bad as I am, or was, he can do it for anybody. I hesitate to stop right now, because I'm right in the middle of this argument. You want to spend just a couple more minutes with me?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. Verses 19 through 26. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law. I've repeated that. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law we become conscious of sin. But now a righteousness from God, apart from law, has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference. Here's a familiar one. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ. And that is why I believe that Paul was a United Methodist. As a matter of fact, John Wesley, who started the Methodist movement, believed in that, and it opened his eyes. And that's when he turned his back on the Anglican Church and said, aha, this is what the church is doing wrong.
That's why we're Christian, though.
Yeah, yes.
Saved by God.
God presented him as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in his blood. He did this to demonstrate his justice, because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his justice at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. Where then is boasting? Is it excluded? On what principle? On that of observing the law? No, but on that of faith. I'm going to end with just one comment that you can take with you for next week. If I can find it.
We'll wait till next week.
No, I don't want you to look at it. This is the thought I want you to take with you. We'll go back and do this. This is critical. The way of obedience to the law is concerned with what a person can do for themselves. The way of grace is concerned with what God can do for you.
Yeah.
Big
It's good.
difference.
Yeah.
What this means is that the way to a right relationship with God does not lie in a frenzied, desperate, doomed attempt to win acquittal by our performance, but it lies in the humble, penitent acceptance of the love and grace which God offers to us through Jesus Christ. Paul was a Methodist, I'm telling you.
Yeah.
Amen.